Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Life's Worth Living podcast. I'm your host, John Gossett, and we are back for another episode. Thanks for joining us again this week. And we'd like to thank our sponsor, GTM Builders, for allowing us to record in their beautiful model home in Overlake. If you're looking at building a new home, reach out to GTM Builders. They are Tooele County's premier home builder. Also, tonight's episode is brought to you by A. Warner Homes Real Estate. If you're a first responder or veteran, mention that you heard about it on this podcast, and they will pay for your appraisal and for your home inspection. Reach out to them at 801-867-5078. So tonight, I am super excited. I have been wanting to have this guest on the podcast for some time. We met, I think it was about a year ago, at a podcast convention where she was a keynote speaker, and she told her story, and the story touched me. I was in tears out in the crowd, but the story was so moving and so important to be told. I thought it would be really great to have her on tonight. So our guest this week is Julie Cluff. So thanks for joining us, Julie.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Well, I am super excited. So we got about an hour, and I just kind of want to dig in and talk a little bit about your story. So, you and I talked a little bit prior to the episode tonight. Take me back to the first time, because you've experienced loss over and over again throughout your life. Yeah. But one of the losses that you suffered was in your 20s. Would you mind telling me the story about that?
Yeah, absolutely. My brother, John, he had struggled off and on. And I think my parents, especially my mom, she was more in tune to it, but he was more aware of his struggles than I think any of us were. But he was a funny guy. Like, my brother was the funniest guy. Like, he could have been a stand-up comedian. We used to tell him he should be a stand-up comedian because he could just do a routine. In fact, in the back, in my reception line at my wedding, there's a video of John, my brother John, and my brother Jim, who are twins, and they're doing this whole Johnny Carson, which if you haven't been around for a long time, you might not know who that is, but I know who that is. And they're doing this whole routine in the back, like imitating and doing these goofy faces. They're both just super funny. But unfortunately, John was suffering more than we realized. There were some things that had happened just a couple years before where it became evident that he was struggling. And then he ended up getting married really young, and married someone really young, and they'd had a baby. And then about 6 months after his baby was born, he attempted to take his life. And it was just so devastating and so shocking. And this has been enough years ago. It's been almost 30 years ago, about 30 years ago, that there was still so much stigma around getting the professional help that we need when we have those hard, tough, dark things happen in our life. And at the time, he got help, like he was getting help. He probably, like in this day and time, he probably would have been hospitalized, but he wasn't. He was seeing a therapist, and my family rallied around him. He was living in Salt Lake at the time. I was living in Florida. My parents were in Florida. That's where I'm from. But my mom flew out. She spent a lot of time, 24/7. He was with somebody in the family. I was still in Florida. I had 2 young children, and I was still in Florida and just kind of supporting from the sidelines and hearing what was happening and trying to keep up with things. And unfortunately, after about 2 or 3 weeks of really holding and some specialized help from doctors and trying to get him on medications, and he went on Prozac, and it seemed my mom and my brother, who are also out here, his twin, seemed to feel like that was helping. But unfortunately, the minute they took their eyes off of him, he attempted again, but this time he was successful, and left his wife with a little baby and newly pregnant. And it was devastating, and it informed it was some of my first experiences with grief. Knowing what I know now, because I'm a professional grief coach. So like, I've studied grief now. Like I've been a student of grief my whole life, just because of different experiences that I've had. But at that point, this was a whole new level of grief from what I had experienced before. And just all the things that come into your mind, what could you have done differently? What could we have done to have kept him here? And how in the world, I remember, and I actually write about this in my book that's coming out next month. I talk about this experience of losing my brother. And I remember the phone call, and I remember I was doing laundry. Isn't that crazy? Like, just the normal things, right? And doing laundry, and I was standing by the washer and dryer, because I'm just getting this phone call, and I'm just screaming. I'm just screaming and crying. I'm like screaming and crying at him. Like, what did you do? Why did you do this? It was just devastating. And because I was so far away, and I knew he was in the hospital, and the phone call, the message that I had gotten was that they thought that he was brain dead. I believe that's what they originally told me. But he was on machine still. So there was still this like, oh, somehow it's all going to turn out okay. The next phone call I'm going to get is that he survived and he's okay. And not being there, I just didn't really have a sense of how bad it was. Even as bad as that phone call was, you just don't know how bad it is. You're just kind of in denial that it could possibly have happened, and that it could possibly be what it is. And unfortunately, obviously, from what I said before, he didn't make it. And I remember flying out to Salt Lake and having a funeral in Salt Lake, and then flying back to Florida to bury him there. And it was after the service at the graveside, we went back to my parents' house, me and my sister and my other brother and our families, and we're all back there. And there's some extended family there, grandparents and a couple of friends. But the people from our church had come in while we were at the gravesite, and they brought in all this food, and they'd set it all up for us. And we're sitting around going, how are we supposed to eat this? It's just like, it was just all so surreal. And then I will never forget, somebody said something funny. It might have been my dad, because my dad was a jokester. But somebody said something funny, and we started to laugh. And it just did not feel right. And I thought, if my brother John was here right now, he would be laughing with us. But he's not here, so therefore we can't laugh. And that was my really first experience with this these wild feelings about, like, so much devastation that there can't possibly be happiness in the world. So that was my experience with losing my brother, and it was tough.
How do you feel that did it change your family dynamics, after losing him?
It did. It's been it did to a certain extent. In fact, a few years later, my parents divorced, and I kind of go back to that and feel like that was a turning point in their relationship where things got hard and it just became too hard. Became too hard. And so I do believe that that was a contributor to their marriage ending. And my brother, John's wife, unfortunately, she decided to separate herself from our family for various reasons, most of which I didn't really understand. And so we were estranged from our nieces, our niece that had already been born and our niece that was born shortly after, prematurely with medical conditions and we weren't able to help her because she chose to separate herself from us. And I think there was just a lot of bitterness. She felt a lot of bitterness about what had happened and her expectations of, I don't want to, I can't say what she was thinking. It's not my place, but it was hard. It was really, and especially hard on my parents. And I was the one that lived near them. And I look back with the experiences that I've had since, and I realized that there was things I could have done that would have been more helpful to them, but I didn't know to do them at the time. I was young.
Well, and I think there's so many things that we tend to beat ourselves up and do the woulda, coulda, shouldas and try to figure out what would have made things go differently. But, we always do the best we can with what we've been given. And
we do. But one of the things that I recognize now is that any time that my mom expressed sorrow, and even to this day, she still talks about my brother's death, and any time at that time, especially when she would express her sorrow about what had happened and the guilt and the shame and everything that goes along with that, like just naturally goes along with that. Anytime she shared some of that, I was always in this place where I wanted to convince her. I wanted to talk her out of feeling what she was feeling. And I see now that that's not really helpful, that it would have been more helpful if I could have been in a place of just being the compassionate listener.
Yeah, sometimes that's hard to do.
It's really hard. And it's especially hard when it's hitting you too.
Oh, yeah.
When you've got a friend that's experienced a loss, and obviously it still affects you because it's a close friend, but it doesn't affect you in the same way as it does the immediate family, then it's easier to listen and just be able to just listen. Because when hard things happen, when we go through loss and we go through grief, our thoughts are muddled. It's very confusing, and there's crazy thoughts that go on. And sometimes those crazy thoughts, because they're going on up here, they're going on up in your head, they come out of your mouth. And now I know that that's what happens. And so I can be a little more patient with those conversations that sometimes you just want to talk people out of feeling what they're feeling.
I think we're fixers. We want to fix.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not our place to fix, just to, like you said, be the ear that listens. And people generally can fix their own problems if they work through it and are listening and seeing, they can answer their own questions. So
well, they have to be in a place of seeking.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when they're talking, they're not in a place of seeking answers as much as they're in a place of seeking a place to express themselves.
Yeah. And I think in telling their story and working through that, healing comes because they're hearing it verbalized versus, like you said, the muddled thoughts that they're dealing with, going through it. Oh my gosh, what a hard thing. And my heart goes out to your parents because, that's got to be one of the hardest things ever.
Yeah.
So,
and I felt like I never, I grieved the loss of my brother, obviously, it was thrust upon me. But within 2 years, my marriage ended. And so about the same time that was happening where I lost my brother, my first husband went off the deep end and started, I don't want to I don't want to catalog all the problems that happened, but he spiraled down, and it eventually affected our marriage, and that marriage ended. And so that was so hard, and that was so immediate, and that was so intense because by that time I had 3 small children. We divorced we separated the weekend that my youngest turned 1. And so I had a 6, 4, and a 1-year-old, and I was trying to figure out how to pay the bills and I had a great job that just was honestly a blessing from God. There's no other way of saying it. It was just a miraculous development. I got this wonderful position. And so I can see all the miracles that happened during that time that sustained me, but at the same time, it was hard. And one of the things that I did, if it's okay if I share this, is my kids were very, very young, and I had a lot of responsibility. I had a lot of responsibility at the job. I was in a management position at a durable medical equipment company, and I felt a lot of responsibility, and I really enjoyed what I was doing. But it was tiring, and I was in a lot of pain because I'd lost my brother, and then I had my husband, and a lot of things, a lot of turmoil in my personal life that actually was the reason I ended up with this job. Because before this, I had been working for my husband. We had started another business, and I was working with him in that business, and he lost that business through some of the stuff that he had been involved in. He lost the business. And so I'd been working with him. I got this other job, like I said, that was just a miracle from God. But I was going through all of this, and I was working long hours, and I felt a lot of responsibility there. And then I would pick up my kids. And luckily, I had family in town, so they were helping me with my kids. And so I'd pick up my kids. We'd come home, and I would fix them dinner, and we would read a little bit. And luckily, they were young enough, they'd go to bed at a decent hour. And I would have that time after they went to sleep. And at night, I would exercise. I'd turn on a tape. I'd turn on a video, and I would exercise to it. And then I would turn on, back in the days of the big speakers, I would turn on sad music, and I would lay on the floor, on the carpeted floor in between the 2 speakers, and I'd cry. And that's what I did most every night for the next 3 or 4 months. And at the time, I thought that was so pathetic. It just felt so pathetic that I was in this place when I had time to myself, that's what I did, that I mourned. But now I know that was exactly what I needed. I needed that space. I needed that opportunity to cry.
Totally. Yeah. I get it. I'm not going to admit to doing the same thing, but I did the same thing. I've been there, and I was one of those that listened to the lyrics, and I'd be like, my kids to this day tease me because they'll say I've lived every word of that song, and they'd be like, oh yeah, it's a story of your life. But yeah, I totally get it. Now,
I don't know if you remember the song, the Bonnie Raitt song, I Can't Make You Love Me.
Oh, yeah.
That was high on my playlist.
I'm guessing it was about the same time period, too. We're young. We're in our 20s, right?
That's right. That's right. We're showing our age.
Oh, my gosh. Now, you had mentioned to me that, as you look back, even, after losing your brother, you look back and there was a little bit of family history kind of where you'd lost others beforehand that were members of your family to suicide as well.
Yeah. And it was definitely a pattern in our family. I actually, my dad's family had been riddled with mental health issues. And in fact, when my brother was diagnosed bipolar after his first attempt, and he went to and was diagnosed as bipolar, it kind of answered some questions about what had happened in my dad's family, because my dad's brother had died at 17 and I was really little, so I never knew Ronnie. And then my dad's dad had died by suicide, and that was when he was in college, and I didn't exist. And then I wasn't on the earth yet at that point. And then my dad's so my dad's father, my grandfather, who died, I was doing some research and found out that my grandfather's uncle had also died by suicide. And this was in the early 1900s. So it was definitely a pattern in the family. And when my brother got that diagnosis, it was almost like we got some answers about the last 80 years.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, I think we've come a long way, even from the loss of your brother. I think we've come a long way in the fact that we're getting better at not being ashamed to admit that, hey, we're struggling and I'm not in a good spot right now. And I think that's a move in the right direction, not only with suicide, but also with mental health issues, that it's okay. It's okay to see a therapist. It's okay to see a doctor. One of the statistics we use in suicide prevention trainings is only 2 out of 5 people with mental illness seek medical help. And so that means the other 3 are probably self-medicating and doing it in a way that's not helpful. And so we try to make sure that, the options are out there, and it's not always involving medication, but there's also other options. There's other things that can lift someone out of some of the mental health issues. But I think we've come a long way.
I hope we have. I hope we have. And I have been, since that experience with my brother, I have a son that has struggled with depression over the years since he was really young. And we got him help right away. And I think having had that experience with my brother, I was much quicker to, in fact, I think all of my kids have seen a therapist at one point or the other. And I have too. It's just, I think when we see signs, you act. And that's a portion of what I learned when I lost my brother, was that with the family history, especially, we just can't play around with it. We just have to seek the help and seek solutions. And the really cool thing about this is that because my son got help right away, as soon as there were some other things that were going on, but as soon as we detected that there was an issue, and I found a therapist and he went to the therapist and so forth. The cool thing about that is now he's a father and a husband, and he still struggles with depression and mental health issues. He's doing well, but he still has his struggles. And the cool thing about it is that he is so open to getting help. It is the best ever. Like, it makes my heart happy that he is willing to seek the help that he needs. And that when we come to him and we say, hey, we're noticing this, this, and this, do you think we need to find somebody for you to talk to? He's like, yeah. Like, I mean, he's just so open to it. And I know we've had experiences with other people when we've suggested therapy, and they just haven't been open to it. So I think as soon as we notice, if we can intervene at that very moment and give people the support they need to get the help that they need, it just makes all the difference.
I think so. And I think when we were kids, it was kind of one of those things you just kept quiet. You didn't
Absolutely.
talk about it. And I was raised by someone that was in the Army. And so it was always, pull up your bootstraps and you just,
Yep.
you get going and you tough it out and you man up. And I think that is where we've really improved, in the fact that we are more open, and I think we are willing to talk about it. It's still not something that's easy to talk about, but
It's not. And I, there's different types of depression. I'm guessing we'll talk about this in a minute too, but, I don't suffer from depression, like chemical depression necessarily, but I've had really hard things happen that have put me into depression. And, so, yeah, there's certain mindsets we live in a world that has become hyper focused on positivity to our detriment.
Yeah.
To our detriment. And we have so little emotional training. Like, nobody talks about emotions or how to handle emotions. And in the work that I do with grief now, I can just see how, and you talked about self-medication, I can see how if we had better understanding of emotional health and emotional stability and emotional hygiene, that some of the problems that we run into could be avoided if we understood our own emotions, and we understood that to have a bad day is not a terrible thing. Because then if we think that it's a terrible thing that we're having a bad day and we beat ourselves up about having a bad day, that turns into a bad week, a bad month, and bad year. And instead of beating ourselves up, we can have some self-compassion. We can have some self-understanding. Anyway, I could talk about that all day long.
Well, and one of the things that I've mentioned before, and I know I think I probably mentioned on the podcast, but they mentioned that in a person's lifetime, they're probably going to go through 6 bouts of real depression. Now, that's not just waking up in one of those moods. You got off on the wrong side of the bed and it's a bad day. These are bouts of real depression that can last for a period of time. But the average person goes through about 6 of those in their lifetime. So I kind of relate that to, I'm a man, and so to get a man to go to the doctor is kind of a chore. We've got to really feel like something's bad if we're going to go to the doctor. But I relate it to, I've always struggled with strep throat. So I'd get strep throat over and over and over again. And, you get to the point where it's coming. You feel like you're miserable. You feel like you are not going to make it. So you go to the doctor. You get into the doctor and the doctor goes, yep, swabs your throat and says, yep, you got strep throat. We're going to put you on the Z-Pack. And I know as soon as I fill that prescription, 5 days and I'm better. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we can improve with people that are struggling, is they have to have that light at the end of the tunnel, that end game, to know that in 5 days, or that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that this depression is not going to last forever. And, life is messy. Mm-hmm. I think you've experienced that. I've experienced it. And I don't know if anybody rolls through life and everything works out the way that they envisioned it, the way that they planned it. It doesn't.
For sure. And in fact, I had a client say to me a couple of weeks ago, she said, well, I'm just waiting for all the problems to stop. And I was like, okay, wait a second. Let's talk about that.
Is that going to happen?
The problems don't stop. And so, that when we have that expectation, when we look at people outside of ourselves where we don't know the whole story, and we look and we think, oh, they have the charmed life, they have no problems, they have nothing they have to deal with. It's not true. It's just not true. And so when we believe that we're being picked on because we have problems, again, it just makes things worse. I can't even remember where I heard this. I heard today, maybe it was you that said it. I was listening to your podcast, that somebody said, the minute that we understand that life is full of problems, life gets better.
I think that was Seth.
Was that Seth?
I
Okay.
think it was.
Yeah, I heard that. I was like, exactly. Like I wanted to, stand up and say, amen.
For sure. And I think just realizing that and there are blessings that come in the mess.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt.
There's things that I never wanted to go through. And there's been multiple ones throughout my life that I would have never wished on my worst enemy. I wouldn't want to have to go through it. But you know what? You get so much strength from that as you come out stronger on the other end. And so your story with loss didn't end with the loss of your brother. You went through in 2007, wasn't it? 2007, you went through probably one of the most difficult stories that I've ever heard. And I remember it like it was yesterday when you told that story in Sandy at that convention. And it touched me. I came home. I told my wife about it. We listened to your podcast so she could hear the story. And I am just in awe of the amazing things that you've done since. But as tough as that is to talk about, I really would love it if you could share that story with our listeners. And
yeah, I'm happy to share because I feel like this is a story this is an experience that has been given to me in order to share with others. That's why I'm here. So, 2007, it was actually Mother's Day. And I was driving with my three youngest children who were, my son David was 8 at the time, my daughter Carrie was 10, and my son James was 12. So we were on a road trip, and we lived in Texas at the time, and we were traveling east. And about mid-afternoon, we were just having this great trip, like just the most perfect trip. The kids were behaving. The sun was shining. It was a beautiful day. Like it just couldn't have gone better than it was going. And about mid-afternoon, as we approached the Mississippi-Alabama border, and just before this, my daughter Carrie had been sitting in the middle seat, in the back seat, next to her brother that was on the passenger side, next to her brother David. And she said, David's bugging me. I'm going to move over. So she moved to the seat behind me. And I looked back as I watched her snap in her seatbelt. And she turned to me and she says, Mom, happy Mother's Day. I love you. And what feels like 5 minutes later, I know it was probably more than that, but what feels like 5 minutes later, I woke up. I was driving the car. And I woke up in the median of the highway. And I was bouncing along the grass in the median. And in my reaction to finding myself in that position, I immediately started to driving a big Suburban, to pull it back up on the highway. And when I turned the wheel to go back up on the highway, in my shock, just trying to respond, I could feel the wheels lift up off the ground, and we just rolled and rolled and rolled, and you can just imagine the crunching and the crashing sounds, and rolled all the way across the highway. But when we landed, I had no eyesight. I couldn't see anything. Apparently it hit my head and it knocked my eyesight out. But I could hear James crying in the seat next to me. So I knew he was alive, but I didn't know how injured he was. I could hear the distress in his cry, but I couldn't see anything. And as my eyesight came back and I, looked at James and I saw him grabbing his leg, but he was okay. I had been calling for Carrie and David, but there was no answer. And I looked back in the back seat and I couldn't find them. And I'm seeing all the glass and the disarray of a crash like that. And then I looked off to my left in the grass. We were sitting upright facing the highway, on the side of the highway. As I looked off to the left, I could see people gathering. what felt like a football field away from us. And that's when I realized that Carrie and David had been thrown from the car as we rolled. And so they were out in the grass, and I knew the minute we landed, the minute the wheels took off from the pavement, that our life was changed. I just didn't know what it was going to look like. And this man approached the car and he said, they're okay. He says, and I said, I need your phone. And I called my husband and I said, I've been in this horrible accident. I don't know if Carrie and David are okay. James and it was just horrendous. And there's no words. I remember seeing the ambulances arrive, and I remember seeing the paramedics, like David, little 8-year-old David, on the stretcher, and his arm dangled over the side as they carried him to the ambulance. But they took Carrie and David to one hospital, and they put James and I on stryker boards and took us to another hospital. And I kept asking, what about Carrie and David? What about Carrie and David? And I had minor injuries. I was okay that way, but I just kept asking, what about them? And I was getting no response until they were finally able to get my husband on the phone a couple hours later. And they put him on the phone and he told me they didn't make it. And when you hear that your kids have died and they've died at your hand because you're driving the car, there's just, it's hard to imagine. I lived it, and it's hard to imagine. So I know how hard that story is for people to hear too. And it was hard for a long time. Interestingly, one of my very first thoughts that first day was that they're eternally safe. But it didn't make it easy for me. I knew from my own belief system, my own beliefs, my own faith, my own understanding, that they were okay, but we weren't. We weren't okay without them. And it was super hard, really hard. And I fought for months to come back from that. And I think, one of the things that I always felt like was that my earlier losses, the things that I experienced before this happened, when my brother died, when I went through a divorce, that I had this understanding that things are hard, but they get better. And this was so much harder, but there was still that glimmer of hope that somehow things could get better. And because I had that glimmer of hope, I was willing to seek. I was willing to look for answers. I was willing to see a therapist, to get help for my PTSD and my depression that came on from being the driver of the car, and the guilt and the shame and the anguish that happened because of that. And I had some little ideas about what might help, and I tried to re-engage with life in certain ways, but I also gave myself a lot of space. I gave myself a lot of space for my emotions and my feelings and my sorrow and my hurt. And little by little, I was able to come back, and with some tremendous spiritual support, and that I can only thank God for every day. And I have, I experienced some real miracles, and I talk about this in the book, and I haven't talked about it as much previously, but it's really interesting. It was about 2 or 3 weeks ago when I got the impression you had those experiences, because, well, let me back up just a little bit. I had these miraculous things that happened that really lifted my depression that I experienced through my grief. And I know that doesn't happen for everybody. I know it doesn't happen that way. for everybody. I know it doesn't happen that way for many people, for most people. It doesn't happen kind of suddenly in this burst of light type experience that I experienced at about the 3-year mark. But about 3 weeks ago, I got a real clear answer from heaven that the reason I had that experience was that I could share with people that there's hope for healing. Is that I'm here specifically to tell people that healing is possible. And I hear every single day, I get on these grief, back when this happened, Facebook wasn't really a thing. It was probably about a year later when I joined Facebook, and over the years it's developed into much more than it was. And so a lot of people go to Facebook for grief support. And there's these huge grief groups. And I watch those grief groups and I see all the despair. And I get it because I was in despair. But the message over and over again is we can't come back from certain losses. And I just don't believe that's true. I believe grief is a season. It's not meant to be a life sentence. We're made for this. The whole world is made for experiencing loss and pain and all of the human experiences, the joy and the pain. Like we're made for this. And the reason I say that is pain and loss and grief and all this myriad of emotions that we experience as a human race have been around since the beginning of time. No one lives forever. And everyone who dies leaves behind people that are sorrowful about their death, no matter their age. People will say parents aren't supposed to bury children, but they do. So when we argue with that reality that parents aren't supposed to, when we argue with that, we just make our pain just so much harder. But when we look at it and we realize pain is just part of the experience and it's a learning experience. And I recently I wrote something where I went through all the things that I had to learn to get to the other side of grief. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of share one other thing about that, because I feel like what happens when we lose, like losing my kids, like how devastating is that? Like how horrific is that? I was homeschooling those kids. They were in my home every single day. They didn't go off to school during the day. They were in my house every day. And they were both dyslexic. None of my other kids were. It's kind of funny, but they both struggled with reading and they had made great strides and, had different levels of learning disabilities, but they were beautiful, brilliant children. They were special. Like they were just beautiful children. And what happens is when we lose someone like that, it's really easy to make our connection with that person, to make the pain our connection with that person. And to feel like if we let go of the pain, we're letting go of the person. But the pain is not our connection. Love and gratitude is our connection. The pain is the grief is a temporary experience. It's supposed to lead us to healing, not to destroy us.
Well, and when you mentioned that everything in life is to prepare you for loss, the first thought that came to my mind was, as children, you have a pet, right? And nothing hurts as bad to a young kid as losing a pet, and it starts from there. And you lose your grandparents, you lose people that you love, and so it is part of the plan.
It's part of life. It is.
It's nothing we wake
like
up.
It.
I was going to say nothing we wake up hoping to be able to go through, but I can't imagine the pain that you must have gone through. I everything about that story, from it being Mother's Day to I think you left your husband at home and you were going to see your family. Was it North Carolina?
Yeah, we were going actually to visit my husband's parents.
Your husband's
Yeah.
parents. God.
Yeah.
But
We lived on several acres in North Carolina. The kids were finally old enough that I felt like I could let them roam down to the creek at the end of the property. And it was pretty exciting to be able to go and enjoy the country. And we never made it.
oh, my heart breaks for you. I can't imagine, but I know we don't know why we go through those things and why we have to go through some of these challenges in our life, but it seems like all of those challenges lead us to the next step. And for you, that next step has been able to guide people through that journey. And quite honestly, had you not experienced it, you wouldn't have been qualified for, walking people through that journey. And so you've been a blessing to so many other people. And I think that we can always find somebody that's got it worse than us, and somebody that's going through something so difficult that we can't fathom it and make sense of it. And so I'm sure in your doing this for quite some time now, you've walked people through journeys that you've gone, wow.
Yeah.
And everybody has a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And and the one thing that I always warn people is, and you kind of alluded to this, is that when people hear my story, I don't want them to think, well, my story isn't so hard, therefore I don't have a right to feel bad, because that's not the way it works. Like it's important for us to honor our grief, and when we ignore it, that's when we get into trouble. When we try to busy our way out of our pain and we think that time heals all wounds, it's not time that heals. And I think this is why people get into that place of despair thinking there's no way out, is because they think that if they wait long enough, the pain will just go away. And there's more to it than that. Like, it takes time and effort, it takes time and attention and action. Like, it's not just the time, it's what we're doing with that time.
And I think and grief comes in steps. I mean, you can't sit it out and, like you said, wait for the time to pass. And that's something in suicide prevention I've seen as we run a support group at our local hospital. The thing that I've noticed is you can have somebody on that 1-year anniversary of losing someone, and you could have somebody in that same room that was nearing a 9-year anniversary, and the pain is the same. The pain is the same. It's always going to hurt.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be fresh in your mind, but you've got to work through those steps of grief and get through it.
Yeah. And I, speaking to suicide prevention, I became, I was thinking about, like, how could I, in my life, how can I end this pain? How can I get away? Because it was so horrific, especially, at certain points in my experience during those first years. And I'm grateful. And one of the things that for me was, having lost my brother, I knew what that looked like for people that were left behind. And I could never imagine putting my family in more pain than they were already in. It was my thought process was a weird mix of, I've already put them through so much pain, therefore, why do they want me here? To, I can't add to their pain by leaving. It was, it's those crazy thoughts that we have when things are hard. And I'm grateful that I continued to seek help, and I continued to seek for answers, and I continued to hold on some days better than others, but I continued to hold on to hope that there were better things ahead. And that's exactly what I found. And so for me now, what life looks like is I have occasional sadness. Like Mother's Day was just recently, and I never quite know when it's going to hit, but I've come to realize that I'm going to experience some sadness during that time. But I don't grieve anymore. Because when I think of grieving, I think of just that deep hurt that just is a continuous ache. And I don't experience that anymore. I really don't. I experience the occasional sadness, but most of the time, the beautiful thing about working through the pain is that you get to the other side and you can think about the good things that happened without it bringing on sadness.
Yeah.
You know, I can think about my kids and I can feel my love for them and I can feel my gratitude for them and my gratitude for having the opportunity to be their mother, even if it was for a short time, and I am still their mother. I will always be their mother, even though they're not here. I am their mother. And so I don't want to say I don't dwell on the pain. It's non-existent. That type of grief pain, because grief really is a season. And when it extends beyond the season, then that's why I do what I do. I want to tell people over and over again, I want to shout from the rooftops, you can get past the pain of grief. Grief is the process of healing. You're not meant to be there forever.
And do you feel like you come out of the grief stronger than you went into it?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's statistics that show that you're more likely to develop post-traumatic growth than you are to develop issues after. So, there are studies that are showing that growth is more likely. But I think there's a message that's kind of become very prevalent in the world that we have to hang on to our grief and grow around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I truly, truly believe that the work is to work through the grief. And there's, process, there's steps that we take that we don't realize that we're missing. And that's why we're still in pain. That's why we haven't been able to resolve things over a long period of time. But I think I started to say this earlier, and I don't think I finished my thought, but I really do feel like if we understood how to deal with our pain, there would be less drug abuse, there would be less, over drinking, all of these things that we do just to numb ourselves. Because when we're pushing away the pain, when we're pushing away the negative emotions, we're pushing away positive emotions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd mentioned to you that we'd been involved in the addiction recovery program, and that's what we found was it didn't matter if it was heroin, meth, alcohol, cigarettes, pornography, whatever from one end of the spectrum to the other. What it was to escape reality.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes our reality is hard.
Yep.
It's hard, and sometimes that escape from reality comes with that numbness that some of those things bring, but it doesn't fix it. And so it delays correcting the problem or working through it so that it can become easier, that you can come out on the other end stronger. And so many people are doing the best they can, just going about it a difficult way, difficult road. And you hate to see people go through that, because for most people, I think you can kind of see the intent is to escape. And
absolutely. And we think that escaping is better, but it ends up being more painful in the end.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the toughest things that, God goes through is watching us fumble around when there's such an easier path. And I think that's part of the chaos that life is, and the mess. And And like I said, nobody is handed this perfect. Sometimes you look at your neighbors and you think, oh, they've got it great. Everybody's got something.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that your father's family was riddled with some mental health issues. You know what family doesn't have that?
Exactly.
What family doesn't have that? Some of us are better at hiding it. Some of us are not. And when you accept that it's going to be hard, like you mentioned, when you accept it's going to be hard, it just continues to get better as you recognize that. So I want to talk a little bit about what you do. You're a grief coach, and people can come to you and help. You can help people walk through that experience.
Absolutely.
And so if people are looking, and I want also people to understand, she has an amazing podcast. I've listened to it for the last year. I don't know if I've heard all of them because you've got a lot more episodes out than I do, but I've listened to quite a few of them, and it's a build a life after loss.
Yes, build a life after loss.
And you can find that on every podcast platform, wherever you download your podcast. So do me a favor, after you're done watching this, go subscribe to hers and please rate and review it because it's amazing. Go back to start with episode 1 and you'll hear a little bit about her journey and then go through the other ones. But tell us what led you to that, because that was quite a few years after the loss of your children.
Yeah. Well, I know just briefly. So about 5 years after my kids died, my mom introduced me to this couple. We went to lunch. She was anxious for me to meet her friends. And so we went to lunch, and this gentleman had been doing a similar work to what you do. He'd had some personal experiences that led him to doing work with people that were dealing with mental health issues and so forth. And somehow in the conversation, the story of losing my children came up. And as we were leaving the restaurant, he basically, the way I remember it, and I don't know if he actually did this, but the way I remember it is that he took me by the shoulders and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You're supposed to do something with this." And it was like a lightning bolt. It was like clear communication from God himself that said, "He is right. You are supposed to do something with this." He said, "I don't know what it looks like, but you're supposed to do something with this." And that was the first real turning point where I started looking. I actually enrolled in college to go back to school to become a therapist. And I knew right away that was not my path. I just as soon as I did it, I was like, nope, this isn't it. And so I just kept searching. And I had some other similar experiences where people gave me messages that I was like, oh, yep, this is truth. And so, I just discovered this coaching experience, which really allows the difference that I see in therapy and coaching. So my experience in therapy myself, when I got better, my therapist one day when we were meeting said, "Well, you're done." And I thought, I'm done? I don't feel done. I don't know what to do to rebuild my life. I don't know what I do now. Yes, I'm better. Yes, I'm not, in this hard place anymore. And I can see light and I see hope for my future, but I don't know what to do. So anyway, I discovered coaching. And the cool thing about coaching is that I'm not a therapist. I'm not there to fix your problems. I'm there as a guide. And so I give you tools and I give you good information that you can so that you can do your work. And it's just the coolest thing. It's just so much fun. I had a client say to me as she was finishing up with our program one day, she said, "I used to think we were all just the walking wounded." And she was just like, "Now, I see there's we don't have to be. We don't have to be the walking wounded." And I loved that so much. I think that was just a perfect explanation. And so I discovered coaching. I discovered grief programs and grief tools that are helpful. I discovered other ones that aren't as helpful. And so, so I've created my own program through studying all these different resources, and it works. It's super helpful to people. And the cool thing about that approach, when people are ready to do the work, is that they improve so much faster. They see results so much faster because they're doing the work. They're making the discoveries. That is just the greatest work on earth.
And I bet that there's been a lot of healing that's come through walking people through that too, and recognizing that life is messy for everybody. And there was nothing wrong with the life you lived. It was messy. Like everybody.
At this point, I feel like my life is so much better than it was before. It's the craziest thing. And I know people don't get that, but I know it's hard to understand. Like, how can life be so much better after having a tragedy like that? And it truly is a tragedy. But it's when you are awakened to the light of life, life is just that much better.
Absolutely.
And it woke me up.
Well, I am so grateful for what you do and for the person you are, and for your willingness to hang out with me tonight and share your story. I want people to realize too, you're a new author. You have a book coming out in July, right?
Yep, next month.
And what's the name of the book and where can they get it?
The name of the book is Miracles in the Darkness, and the subtitle is Building a Life After Loss. And you can download right now. Soon the actual pre-order will be there, but you can go to my website, buildalifeafterloss.com, and you can download the first chapter. And then we'll notify you as soon as my publisher, talk to them this week. Maybe by the time this airs, the pre-order button will be available, but they're trying to get it on their website.
Awesome. Well, I will get it. If I can get you to sign it, I'll get it.
Oh, awesome. I'd be happy to.
I hope that if people are listening to this podcast tonight and you've suffered a loss, whether it be suicide or some other sort of loss, that you'll look at this as a resource. That Julie is amazing. What she does is amazing. And I think it helps when people know that you're coming from a place of experience.
Exactly.
It's you're not just telling them how to get through it. You figured it out to get through it yourself. And so, again, build a life after loss.com, right?
Uh-huh.
Go to her website and see all those things. Pre-order her book. Watch for that to come out. If this is going to air on Monday, so if that button isn't there, keep checking back and order that book. And if you're interested in being coached, how's the best way for them to reach out to you? Through that website?
Through the same website, buildalifeafterloss.com. And there's a tab at the top that says Work with Julie.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being here tonight. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're struggling and you're having thoughts that are scary or hard, and you know you need to reach out, find somebody you trust and talk to them. If you can't find somebody that you're comfortable with, please reach out to the Lifeline. Call 1-800-273-8255. And again, I would like to thank the sponsor of our podcast, GTM Builders. They are Tooele County's premier home builder. Also, the sponsor of tonight's episode, A. Warner Homes Real Estate. Great people. I'm so lucky to have them be part of this podcast and helping it get out to all of you. Thanks so much for coming back for another week. And please, if you have a second and you haven't already done so, please go in and subscribe, rate, and review. And then make sure you go over to the Build a Life After Loss podcast and do the same thing. I think you'll enjoy it. And thanks so much for hanging out with us for another hour this week. And we'll talk to you next week. Thanks so much.